The year was 1648, a time when the church ruled hearts, kings ruled nations, and few dared to seek God for themselves. But in a quiet French town, a young girl was born, a girl who would one day challenge everything her world believed about faith, prayer, and the presence of God. Her name was Jeanne-Marie de la Guyon, but history remembers her as Madame Guyon. To some, she was a saint, to others, a heretic, to all, she was unforgettable. She was a woman who dared to believe that God could be known directly, without fear, without striving, without the permission of men. Her writings spread across Europe, awakening hearts and enraging the powerful. They locked her in the Bastille for 7 long years, but they could not imprison her soul. This is the story of the mystic who turned suffering into surrender, of the woman who found freedom behind bars, and of the faith that refused to die. The year 1648 was a year of turmoil in France. The nation was recovering from war, famine, and social unrest. Yet, in the small town of Montargis, just south of Paris, a child was born whose influence would ripple through centuries of Christian spirituality. Her name was Jeanne-Marie de la Guyon, but history remembers her as Madame Guyon. From the very beginning, Jeanne's life was marked by contrasts. She was born into privilege. Her father, Claude Bouvier, served as a respectable officer of the king, and her mother was a woman of strict piety. Yet, within the walls of their home, Jeanne often felt neglected and misunderstood. She later recalled that her mother seemed distant, rarely showing affection. This sense of abandonment would fuel Jeanne's longing for God's love, a thirst that nothing in this world could quench. As a child, Jeanne was bright, imaginative, and sensitive. She suffered from frequent illnesses, and in her long periods of recovery, she began to seek solace in prayer. At just 4 years old, she remembered being deeply moved by the sight of a religious procession. The sight of priests, candles, and chanting stirred something eternal within her young heart. Though she could not yet understand doctrine, she sensed that God was near. By the time she was 7 years old, Jeanne was already wrestling with the idea of sin, forgiveness, and holiness. Unlike most children who lived carefree lives, she was consumed with the thought of God's presence. She would often slip away to quiet corners of her home to pray, whispering words of love and devotion. Her teachers noticed her unusual seriousness, sometimes even warning her not to take things too far. But Jeanne could not help it. Something within her yearned for union with God. Her teenage years, however, brought new struggles. At 12, she was sent to a convent school. For Jeanne, this was paradise. Surrounded by nuns, prayers, and sacred songs, she felt she had finally found her home. Here she encountered spiritual classics, writings of Saint Francis de Sales and other mystics that spoke of a deeper life with Christ. These texts awakened in her a passion for intimacy with God that went beyond outward rituals. But her stay at the convent was short-lived. After just 2 years, her family withdrew her, fearing she might take vows as a nun. Her parents had other plans for her future. Like many girls of her status, Jeanne's destiny was not to be chosen by herself, but arranged by family. The year was 1663. Jeanne-Marie de la Guyon was just 15 years old, barely a woman, when she was led into marriage with Jacques Guyon, a man over 30. On paper, the arrangement made sense. Jacques was wealthy, connected, and could secure her family's social standing. But in reality, this marriage was the beginning of a furnace of affliction that would refine Jeanne like gold. Life in the Guyon household was anything but peaceful. Her husband was a man of fragile health and quick temper. His frequent illnesses made him irritable, and his unpredictable moods often left Jeanne walking on eggshells. If her husband's temper was one cross, his mother-in-law was another. Madame Guyon's mother-in-law was a controlling matriarch who ruled the home with an iron hand. She criticized Jeanne constantly, supervised her every move,
and left no room for her to breathe freely. For most women, such a life would have crushed the spirit. But for Jeanne, it became the training ground of her soul. She once wrote that God makes use of the most bitter trials to detach us from ourselves and to draw us entirely to Himself. Every insult, every slight, every moment of humiliation was teaching her the way of surrender. Though she lived in wealth, Jeanne's heart was restless. The fine clothes, the grand house, and the respect of society meant nothing compared to the deep hunger she felt for God. She longed for something more, something eternal. Her awakening began quietly. During these difficult years, Jeanne encountered the writings of Madame de Chantal and Saint Francis de Sales, spiritual teachers who spoke about interior devotion and the love of God. Their words were like water to her thirsty soul. She began to realize that true holiness was not about outward religious practices alone, but about the heart's surrender to God. This realization stirred a fire within her. She devoted herself to prayer, often spending long hours in silence before God. In her journals, she described moments when she felt overwhelmed by divine love, times when she lost all sense of herself and became entirely absorbed in God's presence. These were the early glimpses of the mystical union she would later write about so powerfully. But her growing devotion came at a cost. Jeanne's intense spirituality puzzled her family. Her mother-in-law accused her of pride and hypocrisy. Her husband, though occasionally supportive, often grew frustrated with her spiritual intensity. Still, Jeanne pressed on. She knew she had found the pearl of great price, and she would not let it go. By the time she was in her 20s, Jeanne was no longer the timid girl who had entered the Guyon household. She had become a woman of prayer, tested by suffering, and awakened to the reality of God's indwelling presence. In 1676, tragedy struck. After 13 years of marriage, Jacques Guyon died, leaving Jeanne a widow at the age of 28 years old. She was left to care for their 3 children alone. To many, this might have seemed like disaster, but for Jeanne, it was the doorway to freedom. For years, she had lived under the weight of a difficult marriage and the tyranny of her mother-in-law. Now, as a widow, she was thrust into new responsibilities. She had 3 children to raise. The world might have expected her to remarry quickly, securing her family's social and financial standing. But Jeanne's heart was set on a higher calling. She resolved that her life would belong entirely to God. In the stillness of widowhood, Jeanne's spiritual life deepened. Freed from domestic oppression, she gave herself more fully to prayer and study. She began to cultivate what she later described as a continual prayer of the heart, a posture of surrender in which every breath, every thought, every action was offered to God. This was not the prayer of words alone. It was the prayer of silence, of abandonment, of yielding the soul completely to divine love. Jeanne discovered that one could live in unbroken communion with God, not by multiplying devotions, but by resting in His presence.
It was in this period that she began writing about her experiences. Her early works included short treatises and meditations that explored themes of surrender, self-denial, and divine union. These writings were not academic or overly theological. They were practical, deeply personal, and infused with the fire of lived experience. Her insights began to attract attention. People who read her words, or who simply spent time with her, felt drawn to the same intimacy with God that she described. Without planning it, Jeanne was becoming a spiritual guide. Soon, word spread beyond Montérégus. Visitors began coming to her home, eager to hear her speak about the life of prayer. Jeanne had no formal training, no church title, no ordination. She was simply a woman whose soul had been seized by God. Yet her clarity, her sincerity, and her radiant love for Christ gave her a kind of authority that no earthly institution could bestow.
She spoke not as a philosopher, but as a witness. To those who struggled under the weight of rules and rituals, she offered freedom. To those exhausted by striving, she offered rest. Her message was simple. Abandon yourself wholly to God. Let Him be your all. In yielding, you will find true life. Her home became a gathering place. Nobles, commoners, priests, and even nuns came to sit at her feet. Some were curious, others skeptical, but many walked away transformed, sensing they had encountered not just a woman, but a vessel of God's presence. It was during these years that Jeanne wrote one of her most influential works, A Short and Easy Method of Prayer. This little book was revolutionary. In it, she taught that prayer was not a complicated discipline reserved for the learned or the clergy. It was simple, accessible, and within reach of every believer. She wrote that true prayer was a matter of turning inward, of allowing the soul to rest in God's love without effort or strain. The book spread like wildfire. Copies circulated in private circles, then among clergy, and eventually throughout France. For many, it was a breath of fresh air. At a time when religion often felt heavy with ritual and formality, Jeanne's message cut through with liberating clarity. But for others, her words were dangerous. Some accused her of undermining church authority, of dismissing sacraments and discipline. Though Jeanne never rejected the Church's teachings, her emphasis on direct communion with God threatened those who guarded religious structures.
In 1688, Madame Guyon was formally arrested and interrogated. She was accused of misleading the faithful, of undermining church authority, and of spreading false doctrine. For many, such charges would have been terrifying. For Jeanne, they were yet another invitation to surrender. Imprisoned in a convent, she spent months under investigation. Yet even here, she found God. Her cell became a sanctuary, her chains a reminder of the cross she bore. She prayed, wrote, and encouraged others. Her peace disturbed her captors more than her teachings ever had. After a short confinement, she was released. But freedom would not last long. Her enemies were not finished. In 1695, the storm reached its peak. Madame Guyon was arrested once again, this time by order of the powerful Louis XIV himself, who feared any spiritual movement that might destabilize religious unity. She was thrown into the infamous Bastille prison in Paris, a place known for its darkness, dampness, and despair. The Bastille was no ordinary prison. It was a fortress of stone, where political and religious dissidents were silenced. For many, it was a living tomb. But for Jeanne, it became a cathedral. She spent 7 long years there, from 1695 to 1702. 7 years of cold walls, locked doors, and crushing isolation. Yet those years became some of the most fruitful of her spiritual life. It was in the Bastille that she wrote many of her most profound works, including her autobiography. She poured out her story, not as a defense, but as a testimony of God's faithfulness. Page after page, she described how suffering had stripped her of self until nothing remained but God. She wrote, "I was in prison, but I found no restraint within. My soul was free, and it found all things good. God alone was my all, and I had all in Him." While other prisoners despaired, Jeanne sang hymns in her cell. While others counted days, she lost herself in timeless communion with God. She once remarked that she would have stayed in the Bastille forever if it meant greater union with her Lord. During these years, Jeanne's teachings were examined by some of France's greatest theologians. Chief among them was Jacques-Bénin Bossuet, the Bishop of Meaux, one of the most powerful churchmen of the age. Bossuet was a brilliant preacher and staunch defender of Catholic orthodoxy. At first, he showed sympathy toward Jeanne, even meeting with her to discuss her ideas. But as her influence grew, and as quietist controversies spread, he turned against her. He accused her of promoting spiritual passivity, of undermining sacraments, and of sowing confusion among the faithful. His voice carried immense weight, and under his pressure, Madame Guyon was condemned. Yet not all turned away. Her friend and ally, François Fénelon, defended her courageously. He too came under suspicion, but his loyalty never wavered. For Fénelon, Jeanne was not a heretic, but a saint, a woman who embodied the very love of God she proclaimed. Though she would never again enjoy full acceptance in French Catholic circles, her influence was unstoppable. Her writings spread across borders, inspiring seekers in France, Switzerland, and eventually England. The woman who had been silenced by chains was now speaking to generations she would never meet. By the time she was finally released from the Bastille in 1702, Madame Guyon had become a legend. To her enemies, she was a stubborn mystic who refused correction. To her followers, she was a saint purified by fire. She emerged frail in body, but unbroken in spirit. Her years in prison had not silenced her, they had deepened her witness. She wrote with greater authority, spoke with greater peace, and radiated the same calm surrender that had carried her through the storm. Her words after her release were simple yet profound. "I am nothing. God is all, and I am content to be what He makes me."
She was no longer a young widow. She was a woman of 54, marked by years of imprisonment, slander, and physical frailty. Yet those who saw her noticed something remarkable. She radiated peace. The storms had not embittered her, they had refined her. Though free from prison, Jeanne was not free to resume public ministry. The authorities placed her under strict surveillance, confining her to certain regions and forbidding her to teach openly. But even in restriction, her influence could not be contained. People traveled great distances to see her, to hear her wisdom, and to be guided by her in the way of surrender. Eventually, she settled in the town of Blois along the Loire River, where she lived quietly for the last 20 years of her life. Outwardly, it seemed like exile, a silenced mystic, cut off from the stage of public life. But inwardly, it became a season of quiet fruitfulness. From her modest home, she wrote letters of counsel to friends and seekers across Europe. She encouraged priests, nuns, and lay people alike, reminding them that God's love was near, accessible to all who surrendered. These letters, many of which survive today, reveal her deep tenderness and spiritual clarity. Visitors continued to come, scholars, nobles, commoners, even those curious to see the notorious mystic for themselves. They often left transformed. One visitor remarked that her presence alone carried an atmosphere of eternity. In Blois, Madame Guyon also completed much of her writing. She composed hymns, commentaries, meditations, and her remarkable autobiography. Her commentary on the Bible was no scholarly tome filled with academic jargon. Instead, it was a devotional masterpiece, showing how every page of Scripture pointed to the inner work of God in the soul. She approached the Bible not as an intellectual puzzle, but as a living word designed to draw the heart into union with its author. Her autobiography, written partly in prison and completed in later years, was perhaps her most enduring gift. In it, she told her story with honesty, humility, and profound insight. She did not glorify herself, she glorified the God who had carried her through every trial. These writings began to travel far beyond France. Copies were translated into other languages. In England, they were read eagerly by Protestants who found in her testimony a universal message of surrender to Christ. Among them were men like John Wesley, who later credited her writings with shaping his own understanding of holiness and the inner life. Her friendship with François Fénelon remained one of the most significant parts of her legacy. Though Fénelon himself faced censure for defending her, he carried her message into the heart of Catholic France. His own writings, marked with gentleness and grace, were deeply shaped by Jeanne's influence. Beyond Fénelon, her impact stretched across the boundaries of denomination and nation. In Protestant England, her works nourished the Pietist and Methodist movements. In Catholic France, her legacy lived on quietly among mystics and spiritual seekers. Her emphasis on inner surrender, on resting in God rather than striving, resonated with countless believers who longed for more than empty ritual. Though she was once condemned as a heretic, time revealed her as a prophet of the heart. As Jeanne grew older, her body weakened, but her spirit grew stronger. Those who visited her in Blois described her as serene, filled with joy, and utterly detached from the vanities of the world. She lived simply, spending her days in prayer, writing, and guiding others who sought her counsel. In June 1717, at the age of 69, Madame Guyon's earthly journey came to an end. Surrounded by a few faithful companions, she slipped quietly into the presence of the God she had loved so passionately. To the world, her death was a passing footnote in a time of kings and wars. But to those touched by her life, it was the homecoming of a saint. She had once written, "I shall die only once, but that will be for eternity. I shall lose myself in Thee, O my God, to find myself eternally in Thy love." Those words became her epitaph, not carved in stone, but written in the hearts of all who followed her way of surrender.
In the centuries that followed, Madame Guyon's writings continued to inspire. The Methodists, through John Wesley, drew on her works to shape their teachings on holiness. The Quakers found resonance in her emphasis on inward light and surrender. Even modern evangelical and charismatic movements echo her call to intimacy with God. She has been remembered as one of the great Christian mystics, a woman who dared to believe that God could be known in the depths of the soul, without mediation, without striving, simply through love and surrender. Her life remains a paradox. She was silenced, yet her voice still speaks. She was condemned, yet her words have freed millions. She was imprisoned, yet her spirit soared higher than the walls of the Bastille. Above all, Madame Guyon stands as a testimony to the truth she lived. When I am nothing, God is all, and when God is all, I have all I need. Reflection for today's believer.
Madame Guyon's story challenges us to examine our own walk with God. Are we striving to earn His presence, or are we learning to rest in His love? Are we clinging to control, or are we surrendering all to Him? In a world that prizes achievement, Jeanne's life reminds us that the greatest victory is not in doing, but in yielding. True freedom is found not in escaping suffering, but in meeting God within it. Her life was not easy. It was filled with misunderstanding, rejection, and pain. Yet out of that furnace came a faith that has inspired generations. And the same God who sustained her is with us today.